there guys, gals, and non-binary pals, GM Potter here. Welcome to my channel where I review books and bookish things. I like to upload on Thursdays and alternating Tuesdays, and sometimes I sprinkle more videos in as kind of a surprise for you and me. So, today I thought we would go over one of my all-time favorite books, that being The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is my copy of The Hobbit. It's a little worn and a little stained and a little beaten, and frankly I love that. So it's got here, let me take the very well worn book jacket off. This is the naked book. Scandalous, I know. And then it's got the map on the inside, and it's got I love this edition of it because it's Tolkien's original illustrations. So it's illustrated by the author. Several illustrators have taken the time to illustrate Tolkien's masterworks, and you just can't beat the illustrations by the author, in my opinion. In my probably correct opinion. So let's get into it. Alrighty, so as you may or may not know, this book came out in 1937, so it's a very old book, and because of the age of the book, there will be no restraint on spoilers, because while I would love for you to read the book if you haven't, I feel like I can't talk about this book the way it needs to be talked about without getting into as much as I can, if that makes sense. So this book has a 4.28 on Goodreads. This one from me is a solid 5 stars. I absolutely adore this book. I have a Lord of the Rings tattoo. Let's do a quick tour of my bookshelf. I have a Hobbit hole. I have a Frodo action figure. I have a Hobbit doll that I got in a Renaissance fair. And then I've got more paraphernalia in the rest of the house. So I love Tolkien, I love The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. This book for me is my favorite of Tolkien's works. I've read this one, I've read obviously The Lord of the Rings, I've read The Silmarillion, I've read Roverandom, which isn't part of this universe. It's different, but it's fun. I just like Tolkien. I love his writing style, and this book specifically, in my notes here I have, it is a spectacle for the mind and a feast for the imagination. Just the joy and excitement of the author as he's writing is just, it's palpable. You can't read this book and really get into it without feeling the excitement and the imagination and the world building, and it's just glorious. So this book was written by John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, and it was originally supposed to be a story for his son Christopher. Now, something that I learned while I was looking this up is that I believe, I may be incorrect, but I believe this one and The Lord of the Rings were supposed to be two books. That it was supposed to be The Hobbit and The Fellowship were supposed to be one story, and then The Two Towers and Return of the King were supposed to be the second book. And it got split up into 4 books, which, I mean, this one is a complete story, sort of. There are characters that appear in The Lord of the Rings, there are elements, and I love this book. I love the whole series. So, oh, and that being said, there were, not too recently, but recent for me because I still think the 90s were 20 years ago. They're not. That skip the awful movies for The Hobbit. Just skip them and read the book. The movies for The Hobbit are awful. They don't play with the source material very well. They're not good. The Lord of the Rings movies by Peter Jackson. Fantastic, amazing, wonderful. Watch those. Skip the Hobbit movies. So, J.R.R. Tolkien, just a little bit of backstory, was a professor at the University of Leeds and Oxford, and he taught Middle and Old English and Old Norse and Gothic. So he's a professor of languages. He helped write the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. In fact, the Hobbit manuscript was rejected by an editor, not the publisher, but an editor, because dwarves was spelled DWARVES instead of DWARFS. The FS was the version that was actually in the OED, not the VES. And it was rejected, and Tolkien said, I wrote the OED, push it through. And so that's where we have the new spelling for dwarves as that instead of dwarfs. So, very exciting. I love it. This book and the Lord of the Rings series are responsible for my history nerd in me. It kindled my love of lore and history and myths and legends. And you may or may not know this, but my legal first name is Guinevere. And until The Hobbit was read to me, because it was read to me when I was younger, I had no interest in the Arthurian legends. I hated my name, blah, 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 just no. And then this got me into fantasy when I was a kid. And from there, I wanted to learn everything myth and legend and magic, and it's kind of hard to believe that I wasn't into myth and legend and magic and things like that until The Hobbit, but it's true. When I was little, I just didn't care. Like, I was happy to watch Columbo with my dad and more reality-based programming as a kid. And then my mom read me The Hobbit, and it sparked something in me. I love this book so much. I have Arthurian legends that live next to my Lord of the Rings books because of that. That's why they live next to each other. Anyway, on to the story of the book. So, the book starts out with explaining what a hobbit is, and it has one of the best first sentences. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and oozy smell. Not yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. There's a school of writing that you should always begin your works as though your reader is having a bad day. Like, there's a school of thought for writing with that. And they always point to the opening of The Hobbit, because it puts a smile on your face, because you're like, all right, we're getting into it. We're starting off. All right, let's go. And so anyway, Bilbo is a hobbit. He lives in a hobbit hole. And a wizard comes to visit him, and they have words. And the next day, the wizard leaves a mark on his door, essentially saying, hey, I'm a burglar and I'm looking for work. Which is not at all true, because it's a very respectable hobbit, Mr. Bilbo Baggins. And these dwarves come, these 13 dwarves just come into the house, and he's so polite and so frazzled that he never once stops to think, never once actually says, hey, get out of my house, what are you doing here? Because they come right after one another, and they see the mark on his door. Gandalf told them to show up, so they're showing up. And they're not taking no for an answer. And it's just, you jump into the story with such ferocity. And it's utterly fantastical. The dwarves stay all night, and they eat most of his food, and they drink all his beer, and they drink most of his wine and his ale, and just make a nuisance of themselves. And he sleeps in the next day, and Gandalf says, hey, what are you doing? You're supposed to join him. And he's like, no? And Gandalf basically pushes him out the door, and off he goes on his adventure. And Gandalf packs up his things for him and meets him and gives him his things. And the adventure begins, and he goes from being a quite respectable hobbit who never had any adventures to this burglar thief extraordinaire. And oh, I love this book. So there's a bit with some trolls that try to eat them, and Gandalf steps in and gets the trolls to fight with each other over how they're going to cook the dwarves and the hobbit and things until daytime, and then daylight comes through and turns the trolls into stone, and they're free to go and continue on their adventure. And my favorite character in this book is Beorn. I've heard it pronounced Bjorn, but in the audiobook narrated by Andy Serkis, it's pronounced Beorn, so I think that might be more correct. I'd have to look up how Tolkien originally pronounced it, because there are some recordings of him reading and talking about the characters, so I might have to look up that up for the official pronunciation, but I'm gonna go with Beorn. He is a skin changer. He is part bear, and it's my favorite scene when he comes into it, because the hobbits, the Gandalf and Bilbo go first, and they're like, hey, how's it going, blah, blah, blah. And Beorn is a very mistrusting kind of a person. And Gandalf is like, oh, well, we actually have some more people in our party. I didn't want to shock you with them. Let me bring them. And 2 more dwarves come. And he's like, oh, well, that's more people than I thought it would be. But okay, go and continue with your story. And Gandalf talks, and another pair of dwarves come, and another. And Beorn is exasperated by this, but the story that he's listening to is so good that he's like, okay, come on, keep going with the story. Forget the dwarves. Is this everybody? And Gandalf's like, oh yeah, okay, well, there's 2 more. Well, there's another. And it's just, oh, I love this book. And it's my favorite, and they stay with him for a couple days, and sorry, I have a cat here, and he's thinking about jumping in my lap. It's my big boy, my 20-pounder. So they stay with him, and he goes and he double checks on Gandalf's story, because it's a good story, but is it true? It's a wizard. I don't know this wizard. I know him a little bit by reputation. He goes and he finds the goblins that they killed. And oh, I love this book. I love Bjorn. I love everything about this book. There isn't a moment in this book where I was bored, where I was skipping ahead or skimming or anything like that. I was reading and rereading passages as I was going, because they're just so well written. I'm trying not to get too into spoilers, because I'm looking over at my recording and I'm already at 13 minutes and I haven't even talked about the story. But this book is so good, you guys. So good. They go through all these adventures, and they finally get to the Lonely Mountain, which is where they need to go to reclaim the dwarves' gold and treasures from this dragon who's taken it. So they're trying to take the treasures back from Smaug, who is a big dragon. And they send Bilbo in first, right? Because he's the burglar. And he's like, well, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to steal the gold, like, one piece at a time? And he comes back with, I believe it's a crown. And they're like, oh, well, you are a first-rate burglar, because he stumbled upon this magic ring. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so at one point, they get separated in the mountains, and we meet Gollum. We meet Gollum, and the riddles. They go through a battle of riddles, because Gollum wants to eat him. And Bilbo doesn't want to be eaten. Bilbo wants to be shown the way out of this tunnel series in the mountain. And they go back and forth with classic riddles. And Bilbo is thinking, and he's thinking aloud, and he puts his hand into his waistcoat pocket, and he says, what have I got in my pocket? Because he feels something. He doesn't remember putting something in his pocket. And Gollum thinks that's the riddle. And he's like, that's not fair. He's like, well, I asked it. You have to answer. Because Bilbo is very smart at thinking on his feet. And it's the precious. It's the one ring. And Trix Gollum thinks he's been tricked, and he kind of has been. But to be fair, Gollum was gonna eat him. So, there's that. And he gets out, and the dwarves are trying to figure out, well, is he dead? Should we just leave him? Should we give up? Should we go back and rescue him? And Bilbo puts on the One Ring, and he's invisible, walks past their sentry, and says, "Hey guys, I'm here!" basically. And they're like, "Oh, first-rate burglars." Anyway, we get back to Smile again, the treasure. He puts on the One Ring, and he sneaks in while the dragon is sleeping, and he steals, I'm pretty sure it's a crown. And he comes back out, and they're like, "Oh, first-rate burglar, this is amazing." And the dragon wakes up, and they have to take refuge in the mountain, in the lair of the dragon, and the dragon smotes the nearby town of Dale, or Lake Town, not Dale. And it's just, the pacing never lets up. Even when they're relaxing and resting, as it were, the pacing never lets up. Like, you never have a chance to be bored or to be not interested in what's going on. Anyway, so they, one of the men in the town of Lake Town, kills the dragon as it's trying to lay waste to their city, and, well, now the dwarves are free to take their treasure back, and so they take up space in the mountain and take back the mountain, and the men come, and they're like, "Well, we deserve some gold. Dale, which was closer to the Lonely Mountain, had a lot of treasure, and the dragon stole it. So we're entitled to some treasure." And then the elves that they met in Mirkwood, Thranduil, and his elves actually took the dwarves hostage, and there's a big daring escape, but Bilbo packs them into barrels and sends them down the river, and they're damp and half drowned and not very happy. And he's like, "Hey, would you rather still be in jail?" And they're like, "Oh, alright, fine." Like, it's more whimsical than the awful movie. The awful movie turns it into like a fight scene, and it's just so dumb. The book is better. Anyway, the elves come, and they're like, "Well, we should have some treasure because we didn't know why these people were coming through, and they stole our barrels and all of this." And the goblins that have been hunting them come down, and they're like, "Well, we want," and it's the battle of the 5 armies, right? And the good guys defeat the bad guys, the elves and the humans, and the dwarves being the good guys. Massive spoilers. Like, I know I said spoilers at the beginning of the video, and I'll have it in the title as well. Thorin Oakenshield, the leader of the band of dwarves, dies. And he had been angry at Bilbo because Bilbo stole the Arcan Light, which was their symbol of their power over the mountain. And he gave it to the men to be like, "Hey, let us have our share of the treasure back, and we'll give you the one piece that you really came here for." Bilbo stole it and gave it to the men, and Thorin cast out Bilbo, and he forgives Bilbo, and then he dies. And it was heartbreaking. Like, I knew it was going to happen, because I've read this book dozens of times. I knew it was going to happen, and it still broke my heart, because he had gone mad with the gold. Like, he had like a gold madness. And it broke my heart. I knew it was coming, I knew it was going to happen, and it still broke my heart. And that's the power of good storytelling. And Bilbo goes back, and with all of his treasure, he gets back to his house, to his hobbit hole, to Bag End, and he's been gone a year, a little over a year, and they're auctioning everything off. And the Saxville Bagginses, who've always been interested in taking his hobbit hole from him because they want it. They're kind of like the Baron and the Baroness in the Princess Diaries, that, like, may you always be that couple that's trying to take over Genovia. They're kind of based on the Sackville Bagginses. Anyway, that's my personal fan theory. And he has to buy his stuff back and say, "No, I really am Bilbo. I just went on an adventure," and like all of this, and he's never respectable again. And he writes down the story. The story is The Hobbit or There and Back Again. It's Bilbo's story that he wrote down. And it's just, if you haven't read this book, please, please, please read this book. It is so good. It is honestly one of my all-time favorite books. Have you read The Hobbit? Have you read Lord of the Rings? We'll be doing those next. Let me know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.